The National Council of Teachers of Mathematics welcomes you to Adding It All Up, a podcast created by and for mathematics educators and teachers. Join us each month as we explore current topics, insights, and emerging trends with thought leaders in the math community. And now, the hosts of Adding It All Up, NCTM President Latrenda Knighten and NCTM Past President Kevin Dykema.
You know, when we think about improving math instruction, most of the time we think about focusing on the classroom. We think about the teacher's actions, what the teacher's doing, if students are being engaged in the activities in the classroom, and what types of strategies are being used.
Absolutely, but there's so many other layers of support that really can impact the quality of mathematics instruction. And I'm so excited today that we're going to look at one of those other layers of support. We're going to look at the role of the mathematics coach today.
Exactly. And the coach plays a pivotal role in what happens in math instruction. We know that coaches are there really to be that guide for teachers. They're there to support teachers. Sometimes they offer feedback. Sometimes they offer just a little extra advice. Sometimes a hug or two is needed some days. And so really coaches are there to help enhance and elevate what happens in the classroom. And so it's really important to remember that a coach is not there to fix things that are broken. They're there to be a learning partner so that teachers and coaches and students ultimately are learning and growing together.
And being a coach is such a unique role. Part of the responsibility of being a mentor, part of it's being a collaborator, part of it's being a hugger on those days, part of it's being a problem solver. It's more than just knowing about mathematics. It's really knowing about how to support people as they are trying to teach mathematics to students.
That is so true, Kevin. And I know from my experience as a coach, it's not a small task. It's a role that has many facets to it. So I'm so excited that today we are going to explore the world of math coaching with two of our favorite math coaching experts who've really spent a lot of time thinking very deeply about this important work. They've written an incredible book that I know a lot of you are excited to hear them talk a little bit more about. And it's really on the topic of math coaching, and they have a lot of insight to share with us today.
Their book, Proactive Mathematics Coaching, Bridging Content, Context, and Practice, introduces us to the Proactive Coaching Framework, or PCF, which helps math leaders intentionally refine their practices and design those professional learning experiences that are so valuable. They believe that the real shifts in teaching happen when we bring together the context of our roles and the mathematics content that we teach.
So true. In their book, they dive into practices like co-teaching, analyzing student work, engaging in lesson study as a tool for professional learning, and even just helping coaches prepare for those courageous conversations. And all of these things the goal is to foster growth in teaching and ultimately growth in learning for students. So whether you are a math coach yourself, or if you're a teacher who is fortunate enough to have a coach who supports you, or you're just curious about how does this work? This is something I want to know. What is the impact of coaching on math education? You are in for a great treat. This is going to be a great conversation today.
I'm so looking forward to it. So let's bring in our two guests, Latrenda. Let's welcome those authors of the Proactive Mathematics Coaching, Courtney Baker and Melinda Knapp. And let's get their insight onto what makes mathematics coaching such a vital and impactful part of education. Welcome, Courtney and Melinda. If you want to just introduce yourselves briefly, then we'll dive in and start talking about mathematics coaching.
Hi, I'm Courtney Baker. I am an associate professor at George Mason University up near Washington, D.C. in Virginia. And my background is, as you guys spoke of, is the math leadership spaces. Elementary educator, math coach at the school and the district level, professional development designer. And I have the honor and privilege of being the academic program coordinator of a math education leadership program, a math coaching program, where I get to work with in-service teachers and work on the content, pedagogy, and leadership and learn from each of them every time I interact with them during classes and professional learning.
Thanks, Latrenda and Kevin. I'm Melinda Knapp, and I'm an assistant professor at Oregon State University, Cascades, in Bend, Oregon. And similar to Courtney, my background is in K-12 education. I was a middle school math teacher, an elementary and middle school math coach. And one of the things I think, and we'll get into this later, is this idea of developing from a teacher to teacher leader to coach, and that process and identity work. And so it's a pleasure to be here and excited to talk to you all.
Thank you so much again for joining us. And we are ready to just dive in. So, Courtney, I'm going to start with you. So, what would you say are the main roles of a math coach in a school setting? And why is this specialized role so important?
Melinda and I were talking about these questions before we came on, and that question is so loaded. And it's one of the things we really try to unpack in our book, right? And it goes to what Melinda was speaking of when she did her introduction about the various roles and identities. And so one of the things we focused in our book is this act of coaching, right? As in terms of an act or a process in terms of just the individual, because we shared in our intros and a lot of your audience members know there's a lot of ways to engage in math leadership in K-12 spaces, right? You could be a classroom leading a professional learning community, or classroom teacher rather, leading a professional learning community. You can be an actual physical coach. You may work with students, you may work with teachers, work within the community, or perhaps particular grade levels. You can be an interventionist and work primarily with students. And so the flexibility of the role is a huge asset, but it also complicates things because it's hard to know what the role is. And that role is, again, we try to capture that in the nuances of some of the chapters in the book, really dependent on the context you're in, right? So there's these contextual nuances for leadership that there is some agency in how you engage in those spaces. Overall, no matter what role you're in, as we think about math leadership, we really center on this idea that this math leader, this math coach is someone who is there in this K-12 space, whether it's in a district office, in a classroom, in school, across multiple schools, part-time, full-time, that they're really there to bring coherence across the math program, across the math initiatives, and to build capacity across the different stakeholders that they might engage in, so that changing the status quo of math and of anything, let alone math instruction, is hard, and it's nearly impossible to do it by yourself. And so how can you build up this collaborative space to do that work? Right, Melinda?
I think if we're going to generalize a role for a coach or a leader, is building that professional learning space. And you mentioned this in the introduction, is how can we learn together? So what role do you play as that leader in designing, organizing people, creating that positive environment, setting goals with administrators? So if you have a formal role, you're called a coach, you're called a leader, to you're taking on leadership actions. I mean, one of the things I think, and Courtney and I've talked a lot about this, is the role of the leader isn't always this title. It's really in the actions that you take. And so as we think about this, and I think as we write about it, we talk a lot about like actions, right? So what are these folks doing to support that learning across the spaces that they work in? That's like the generalized idea about what these roles are. And it's complicated, right? It's not do this, do this, do this, do this, and you're good. That's why I think this is just as nuanced and complex as teaching. Coaching is just as nuanced for that role. And you can't just turn a switch on and I'm a coach today without some of that learning. And that's what's driven us for our work, is what is that learning? What does it look like?
I think the answer to that too, Melinda, you bring it up, is this idea that when we first started working together, whether it was students or people we worked with, everyone was like, well, how do you know what to do? Right? I'm a coach. How do I figure out what it is I want to do? And we come from an approach where in our teaching, both in K-12 spaces and at the university, it stems from inquiry, right? So we naturally ask questions, similar to implementing a rich math task, right? How do you know? Can you tell me more about this? And so that's naturally where our stance is with coaching, right? And so the answer, we joke that the answer is like, it depends. Right? So what's your building? What are the initiatives that have been in place? What are the things that's been tried? Tell me about the stakeholders you're working with. There's no cut and dry answer. I think, Melinda, the thing I would think we try to do in the book, when we talk about that role and the interactions and centering this work of coaching on the actions is that we also challenge the reader or the audience to really think about, it doesn't matter what the size of those interactions are, right? Like you can plan a coaching interaction that's a full coaching cycle with the pre-conference, the observation or the co-teach, the debrief, but that you can also plan a very intentional, proactive conversation that's 5 minutes with a principal, or a 10-minute snippet of time with a collective group of teachers, either in a professional learning, walking by in a hallway, right? And so really thinking about building capacity through a variety of these actions or even inactions.
So I think we're continuing to get this sense that the coaching role is a multifaceted and it looks different depending on the day, depending on the teacher you're working with. In your book, you talk about the proactive coaching framework and how it supports professional growth in math coaching. Can you explain a little bit more? What is that proactive coaching framework? What are some of those key strategies that mathematics leaders can use to implement that framework?
Our framework is, you can imagine it as a planning guide. So a planning guide or a planning tool for coaches. So this idea of being very intentional in all your work. So 33 questions that really guide a coach to think through all the things that they might want to think through in planning an interaction. And as Courtney said earlier, the interaction can be a conversation with a principal. An interaction can be working with a grade level team. It could be planning a multi-day PD. And so it's a planning tool to help coaches be very strategic in planning, and it puts NCTM effective teaching practices in conversation with effective coaching practices. So it really helps a coach think through, like, what are my goals? And then what kinds of coaching practices can I use to achieve those goals with teachers? So it's a guide to help set those goals, plan the professional learning, and then even reflect. So it's a pretty typical cycle that a teacher might think through when planning a lesson. What are my goals? What do I want the students to learn? How am I going to go about doing that? And then did I reach those goals? So it's a very similar framework of thinking, but it is specific to coaches. So an example might be if a coach is, let's say the initiative or the thing that they're working on at a school is to facilitate meaningful discourse. So this is a goal across the school. A coach might take the framework and plan math labs to say, okay, we're going to work on this across a grade level team. And so those questions in the framework can help the coach plan that interaction, putting those ideas into play. And that is one of our coaching practices, is using math labs. We might incorporate rehearsing discussions. So rehearsals are part of our coaching framework. We might also analyze classroom video together. So this framework helps a coach think through, what are all the things that I might do to support this professional learning, right? And I've set these really intentional goals. It wasn't a real short version of that, but that's essentially what this framework does through this questioning, right? Is like, it's a planning tool for a coach.
Well, and I think it's important too to mention in this planning tool, think about the number of decisions that an educator makes. Think about facilitating a rich task. Which task are you going to use? What's the cognitive demand? How are you going to create access and entry for each individual? What manipulatives might you use? So all of this decision making goes into a task or an interaction from a teacher with students. And the same type of decision making goes into a space where a coach or a leader is working with other individuals, other educators in their building. And so I think a piece of our framework that is really important is that it helps with the decision making, but it really elevates two pieces. It elevates the context so that the contextual nuances that are unique to that interaction, right? Even if I am from a K-6 math coach and I'm working with a first grade team, that's going to be really different than if I'm working with the sixth grade team. There's some pieces in those interactions, maybe the principal initiative, school improvement plan goals, that might feel the same, or I can use that knowledge across both interactions. But there's some of the knowledge there that's going to be really specialized, right? And that's how we humanize our practice. That's how we really connect with individuals. And so one of those prongs is the context, and it goes across the 4 phases of the proactive coaching framework, and it focusing on questions on the contextual pieces that are really important to unpack. And the other prong focuses on the content, math content. And something that Melinda and I, now we've gone back and we've been really passionate about this idea is if you're not coaching the math content, what are you coaching? But you have to pay attention to those contextual nuances. And so the proactive coaching framework really marries or merges these two ideas with a series of 33 questions to help anyone who's using it, whether you're a classroom teacher, a math coach, part-time, full-time, a district leader planning professional learning. How can you consider the content and the context of this interaction that you're going to plan?
You guys have shared some wonderful insights on your framework, and it's so obvious how much work and thought has been put into making this something strategic, something intentional that coaches can use. And you've alluded to some of the things I'm going to ask in my next question, but I want us to think about people who come to the coaching world. Maybe they're new to coaching, or they're a teacher leader who is coaching from the classroom. Maybe they have some coaching activities they have to complete, but they also are working with students. So maybe haven't had a lot of experience with this. So when you think about the proactive coaching framework, how does using this help a math coach or a teacher leader, particularly a novice coach, set intentional goals for teacher development? Because both of you talked about the importance of not just looking at the coaching aspect and what's happening to support the teachers, but you also mentioned the importance of thinking about improving maybe the teacher's content knowledge or making sure you strengthen those things. So if I'm new to coaching, what are some things that will be helpful to me using this framework to help me to set intentional goals for teacher development? Because ultimately, that's probably what someone is evaluating my performance based on. How am I impacting those things?
Yeah, so I think that's really powerful, right? The question that's at the center of our book is what I'm doing effective and who is it effective for? And so, Latrenda, you talked about this idea of novice coaches really wanting to know, what am I doing and how am I doing it and is it working? And those are the same types of questions that we find experienced leaders, right? As reflective practitioners, we want to know, how am I doing? What's this interaction? How is it moving forward? What's my next steps going to be? I think the proactive coaching framework does that through not just the 33 questions, but the specific phases that Melinda alluded to earlier, where in phase one, you're using these questions to really assess your situation, what's happening, so that if you're getting the lay of the land, you have an understanding of the current reality in that building or in that space. The second phase is all about goal setting. You're going to ask yourself questions because, again, this is a reflective protocol for you to think about and maybe collaboratively or maybe independently reflect or plan an interaction. And so really having this idea of a whole phase focused on not just student goals and not just teacher goals, but what's your coaching goal? So often in this reactive practice, we talk about proactive and reactive practice. And both of those are parts that are part of reactive is definitely a part of education, right? We walk into a space, something happens, fire drill, someone gets sick, we get pulled for a meeting, right? All these things happen and we react to them naturally. It's part of our job. But as a coach, right, you don't only often have one classroom, you have multiple classrooms or multiple spaces. And so when you're constantly reacting in any educational role, you're not feeling effective. You don't know what you're looking at. So that goal setting can really, really help you to make intentional goals for your audience that you're working with, for you looking at the whole of the big picture, right? Zooming out and looking at, well, how am I building capacity and creating coherence across all these stakeholders? What can I do to help almost this vertical articulation of knowledge, right, across the different stakeholders that I work with? So I think one way that it really helps with that intentionality is through specific goal setting.
When Courtney and I were first developing this and exploring this, and we're having colleagues try this out, there was a tendency with especially newer coaches to get kind of stuck in the observing and assessing and just gathering all this information. And then they would get stuck on sort of, what's my next step? What's my action? And so we found that setting these short-term goals, combined with longer term goals. So we might say a longer term goal is we're trying to detrack the school or the district. Like that's a really huge goal, but I need to set very intentional short-term goals to get to that. And that's where you're going to feel success. And so moving some of these big ideas into action is also part of this framework. That goal setting is really important. I didn't think of this when I was a new coach. I didn't necessarily, it seems like you should make the connection, but like, oh, I need my own goals. So it just seems like a really important part and sometimes overlooked. I think we get caught up in being reactive, as Courtney said. I think that's just something. And again, this is for experienced coaches and newer coaches. I think that's a really helpful piece of this framework.
So we know coaching is hard work. We know teaching is hard work as well. And we know that sometimes not all teachers that we're coaching may have the same viewpoints of how math should be taught. There may be some that are a little resistant to change it. They don't have that need yet. And so part of the coaching role has to be building positive relationships with the people that we are coaching. Do you have any ideas? How can a coach help to create that supportive environment for growth and help all of us recognize we all need to be continually growing? How does that math coaching really help collaborate and facilitate that positive math culture in an entire school? Do you have any strategies for getting collaborative efforts going and being successful?
I mean, that's actually probably one of the most common questions that we get asked from people who are in coaching roles, because it feels like it's an enduring question, right? We all face this. And so Courtney and I like to reframe this idea from resistant to hesitant. So there's some hesitation there. I think a lot of this stems to how coaches get positioned. So are you positioned by yourself, positioned by other people as coming in as a sort of a fixer? And that's not a productive way to be positioned. And so coming into an environment, whether you're a school coach or a district coach, how can the framing of your work or the reason why you're there be more about the learning, right? We're creating this learning environment together. And I think it's really important to have principals and have everybody sort of who's working on instructional improvement position a coach in that way, right? So that you can be the confidant or you can be that person that teachers want to go to when they're struggling or having challenges in their classroom. And so we also have to position ourselves as co-learners. So we are going into this environment. Yes, we have specialized knowledge, but we also need to work alongside teachers and create that environment. And I think some strategies, just in my experience, Courtney's experience, is developing learning opportunities for people to learn together. So whether that's a grade level team, instead of coming in and you're going to run the meeting and we're going to do what I say, but it's really this collaboration. Like, what do the teachers want? What do the teachers need? Meanwhile, you have all your goals in your mind, right? So it isn't that you're going in there without a plan. It's just really more about how do you merge what people want to work on with what you're seeing as like these larger goals and creating collaborative opportunities to do that. And I think the other thing too is we often hear you need to build a relationship first, right? So relationships key. We know this. We need to build relationships with students. Same with teachers. We've talked a lot about this, and we think that through this work, though, that is the relationship building, right? We're building relationships around the work and the thinking and the math. And so we see those things as happening side by side, not first and then second, because our work is urgent as well. So when we're there as a coach, we're there as a support, like there's things to be done, right? There's learning to be done. And so we feel this urgency, especially when we think about equity and inclusion and really trying to create spaces for kids. There is this urgency. And so the relationships come through, I think, that collaborative work together. And that can look a lot of different ways, right?
I think something that's really important to build on what you're saying, Melinda, is it's really, really important to just to remember that people are showing up for this job of teaching, right? They are coming every day. They care about their kids. And all the funds of knowledge that the kids bring to the classroom are different. And we constantly talk about how do we honor and how do we build community and how do we bring in this asset-based perspective so we can truly think about what students do know. And the same goes for coaching in this parallel and working with stakeholders and educators, right? It's really important to remember that. And it's also important to remember, and I don't know if these are necessarily strategies, but things to just keep in the back of your mind is that our practice is one of the most personal and private things. And I don't mean like doors open or closed. I mean, going back to Melinda, what you said earlier, it's grounded in our identity. It's grounded in who we are, what we value, what we hold to be true about teaching, knowing, learning. And so when we have any kind of interaction in coaching or leading, we're trying to change the status quo, even just implementing a number routine or a rich task. And so we're asking someone to take some part of their practice and tweak and change it. And so that space of vulnerability where we share what we as a coach or leader are vulnerable with, like, oh, hey, I've never actually done this number routine either in a classroom. I've only done it as a coach. I'm wondering if we can try this together. That's that way of showing that you're also willing to take on something new and try something different, right? For the benefit of student learning, for the benefit of humanizing students and putting them first. So I think that idea that practice is inherently personal is important to remember too.
That's huge. Being vulnerable with teachers in those spaces, I think that is, yes.
Capital letters, underlined.
So true. You ladies are speaking to my heart. Just thinking about just the humanizing that we bring to the coaching practice. And you've given a lot of advice, a lot of ideas about how do we look at coaching maybe a little bit differently than some people have looked at it before. So let's think about here's someone who's just getting started with math coaching. So we'll go back to that person who's just starting. And so they're thinking about what maybe they know as math coaching, but they're thinking about adopting the proactive, reflective math coaching practice. So, what would be some advice you would give to that person to get started as they start to develop those skills? Because as we know, it doesn't happen overnight. And there's so many things that you need to do to be reflective in that process. But what would be some advice you would give to someone who wants to really adopt this framework and make it their own?
Yeah, I mean, I have a few. I think we've talked about some of these, but starting with those clear goals. Yeah, thinking about what the goals are for learning and not other people's learning all the time either, like our own learning. I think that is one thing about the proactive coaching framework. It really is a tool to help a coach learn about their own practice. So there is this additional layer of not just what I'm going to go do and what I want the students and the teachers to learn, but what do I also learn in the process? So that learning for myself as a coach is embedded in this too. So again, if we're going to be collaborators in these spaces, we actually need to think about our own learning too. So start with those clear goals for ourselves and for the work that we're going to do with teachers. I think monitoring change, that's part of the work. You set those goals and then what is it that we're going to look at to see how we're doing? And look at the small things, right? It doesn't have to be the huge thing because when we're talking about education, those can be years. But start with the small things. As I had more students talking, this work we did caused more students to have opportunities to talk in a classroom. That's a huge win, right? And so looking at those bright spots. So a coach can be in that role of helping point those things out. I think the other thing is to focus on equity and inclusion, have those be really integral in the goals that you're setting. It's not sort of an add-on or over here, we're going to go work on that. It's really all together. And so just being mindful about that, moving beyond sort of the idea of building relationships first and then coaching second. It's like they're really all together. And then work closely with administrators. I think that sometimes newer coaches, maybe especially, that might not be a comfortable spot for them. But I think, again, building that team and then leaning on other coaches and leaders. Coaching can be a really lonely job if you are the only one in a school or maybe even in a district. Some districts might only have one coach. So finding a community of other coaches and leaders that you can collaborate with, work with. I think that's also a key piece. So those are just some of the things that I've been thinking about.
I also think about I can't remember if it's in the preface or chapter 12. So it's either in the very first part of the book or the very end of the book. And I actually think it might be in both. And I think it's a really important part to think about is that just because we've put the 33 questions out there does not mean someone has to use all 33 questions at once, right? So when we've done the work, I don't know, the protocol's been around and in use, and I think it's how we approached our coaching interactions and leadership for first, right? So that's many years ago. But then also thinking about this idea that we've been really thinking about what happens when people are using this. And so some people, and you'll see this in the different cases, some people use all 4 phases, all 33 questions. They sit down, they write reflection. I think the writing the answers to the questions, I think it brings transparency in a way that when you read a question and you're like, oh, I know the answers, and you kind of list off the things. I think the pausing and writing is a really powerful strategy when just starting. I also think this idea of focusing on maybe a phase or a single question or a phase. So maybe try phase 1 first. Or if you're like, I had never really goal set before, work phase 1 and 2. Maybe there's a specific question that you really want to challenge yourself with. We found that some people in phase 1, where you're learning about your context or really illuminating those contextual nuances, some people it was ingrained in their practice and they really focused on that goal setting because that was a new thing. Some people, Melinda talked about it in terms of novice, but it also happens depending on how your role is set up. Some people got stuck in phase 1. And they were spread too thin across too many different stakeholders and too many schools or too many locations. And so it created this awareness that, well, I'm a district leader. I'm split across 16 schools. My role is to be in schools on so many days or visit these schools. I can't move forward because I'm only in there in each school once every 2 weeks. And so you're constantly reassessing the situation. And that conversation was like, well, maybe that structure of once every 2 weeks wasn't helping the situation to move forward. I also think a way to think about using the framework for people who are just trying out is to take a look at, like, Melinda said, this idea of assessing what practices you're using, right? So if you're constantly going and drawing on co-teaching or modeling, think about why is it that you're drawing on co-teaching and modeling? Is it comfortable for you? Is it part of your school improvement plan? Is it part of the culture? Do you need to expand your professional learning around another practice, right? Do you want to posit those questions to the teachers? And then as you start thinking about your audiences and who you're using the proactive coaching framework with, another question really centers on, well, who are you interacting with? Because your actions are really important as any educator, but specifically a teacher leader. Your inactions are just important. Are there spaces or places that you are not comfortable and you are avoiding because of that? Melinda and I, when we do conferences, we share those moments with others. We're like, I can remember when I was a math coach in elementary school, there was a hallway I did not want to go down some mornings when I first got there, right? And you can pick the reason, you can pick the people. Everyone kind of nods and giggles and laughs. And they're like, oh, yeah. But by me as a leader not going down that hallway and not engaging, I'm also a resource for math teaching and learning. And that's not equitable to those students and those teachers just because I'm uncomfortable, right? And Melinda, you can extend this too, but we really view coaching as this space to help create more equitable learning environment.
We often say we wouldn't not work with certain students. It's kind of the same as just working with the teachers who want to work with us, right? Because there is a tendency to want to do that. And we examined our practice. It's like, well, the teachers of those students were not getting access to professional learning, let's say. And so that didn't feel equitable. And so we often think about why building the community is so important in a school, because that invites everybody in and not just the teachers who want to work with us or seem eager to work with us, because it can be easy to get sucked into that. And so we just think about the framework, again, can kind of push a coach to think about that as like, oh, am I avoiding, or am I not using certain practice? Am I always modeling in classrooms? What can I do to sort of push my practice, right? So again, it's an opportunity for professional learning for coaches as well.
Well, Melinda and Courtney, you've given us a ton to think about already and all these different aspects of it. As somebody who's a seasoned middle school teacher, when I started out my teaching career almost 30 years ago, there was no such thing as a math coach. Or if there was, they didn't have that title. They did it as a more of an informal thing. So from your perspective, how do you think this field of math coaching has evolved over the years? And if you put your crystal ball on, where's it going to go in the future?
This ties so closely to the work Melinda and I do both at the university and researching and really thinking about it. Field of math coaching is new, and it really stems from some of the NCTM calls in the 1980s from the NCTM president, John Dossie at that time, saying, hey, we need elementary math coaches. We need more support, more professional learning. And it makes sense that we have a finite amount of time in preparation programs, and we need ongoing professional learning. And we know that ongoing professional learning in practice, when it's embedded in that school space, is most effective. And so those calls kept coming, especially in the early 2000s, is really when coaching kind of took off in practice. And in fact, it was ahead of research, right? So that's an interesting fact that on my other hat, researching math specialists and thinking about the preparation and what do we know, the practice is really guiding and leading the way in a lot of this. And research is catching up, and we're getting there, right? But it's a complex system. You have all these different layers of interactions and people, and everyone wants to center in on, well, how are the students doing? But if you think about, depending on your role as a coach, you might not even work with students. You might be completely grounded in professional learning and developing and designing that for teachers. I think the field has greatly evolved in the last 2 decades. There's a lot more research. Like I said, some of my work with some other colleagues is really centered on synthesizing that research and what do we know as a field. I think we've gone from studying the roles and the different dynamics of what the math specialist or math coach can do. And it's now, okay, what's their influence and impact? How do they work with systems? So I think the things we're looking at studying we're just ready to go to that next level, right? And so I think we've got a decent foundation. We're still learning, I think, in practice with an emphasis on accountability post-pandemic. I think there's a more critical look on, in terms of probably more increased emphasis on standardized assessments. At least here in Virginia, and I can see everyone nodding. And I think that people are looking at ways to help students to engage in more math teaching and learning. And I think math coaching is in the conversations a lot more. And I think that recognizing that we now have some research around these topics of math coaching and math specialists, we're showing positive impacts on both teacher professional learning and students. I can see more people drawing on that. There's more states who are engaging in their licensure or preparation programs.
So to reiterate, I do feel like the research and coaching, we're still really in our infancy of understanding what coaches can do. I think depending on finances, coaches come and go, which doesn't help. There's the stability, it just isn't there. I think coaching is still, like, depending on where you are these specific content coaches? So are you a mathematics coach? Are you an instructional coach coaching everything? And I think, again, there are so many models across, but I think what's coming next, or what needs to come next, is that more formal preparation, because we're really dealing with transitioning probably from a teacher to this coach. And that process isn't just something that you just know how to do. I think seeing the value of coaches, right? I think the research needs to back up so that districts will honor the work that coaches do and the preparation that they need. I also think, how do we have more teachers have access to coaches? I haven't necessarily done this, but I know a lot of work is kind of thinking about video and how do we have accessibility for teachers that maybe a district can't afford a dedicated coach. And so how do we think about that? Again, I don't think these are answered questions. I think people are working on these things, which is really exciting, and just kind of, again, our passion. And I think there's just so much more to learn, and it's really an exciting time.
And I think too, building on that, this idea of learning how to shift the narrative, of what it is we, field, policy, public, whoever, What is it we use to determine what effective is, right? In the book and the professional learning that we do and teaching at university, there's this constant conversation that we're having about, okay, so what data are you going to use? Data could be images of student work on a wall, right? If you're doing a learning walk with an administrator, data could be, hey, in the CLTs or collaborative learning teams, professional learning, your teamwork, what are the 2 or 3 guiding questions we're using, and how do we come about that? Data could be rich math tasks, right? And the type of conversations. It could be going back to the point Melinda brought up about more students talking. It could be just capturing, well, what is the conversation? What are the questions the teacher's asking? There's so many data points that can help us to determine if what we're doing is working for students, but they're not always the mainstream story or narrative of what, I'm going to use air quotes, right? What counts. That's air quotes because it's a podcast, right?
This has been a wonderful conversation. So, Courtney, Melinda, thank you so much for first the gift of your book, Proactive Mathematics Coaching, and for just a wonderful discussion to kick off our first Adding It All Up for 2025. Think about New Year, New You. So you've given us a lot of things to think about and to reflect on as we start 2025. Thanks again for listening.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Adding It All Up. At NCTM, we strive to bring you the biggest topics happening in mathematics. Join us next month for another exciting discussion.